The gavel cracked like a bone and the courtroom exhaled, and Maya Collins felt the floor tilt under her shoes as the acquittal rang. Daniel Reyes said, "Breathe, we move on facts." And she nodded while every exit mapped itself in her head. Her phone vibrated with a number that wore the night like a mask, and she stepped into the corridor where lights buzzed like insects. Jax Monroe said, "You don't know what really happened to Lila," and the words slid under her ribs. Daniel said, "Who is that, and why now?" And the echo from the chamber sounded like a dare. Maya whispered, "I hear a humming on the line," and it matched a tune she had saved for grief. Jax said, "Someone close scrubbed the truth clean," and the seal on the letter in her pocket grew heavier than her keys. The crowd spilled down the stone steps, and the verdict's echo trailed them like smoke, and Maya traced the seam of the sealed envelope, as if it might answer first. Daniel said, "If the call is real, we verify before we move," and his voice steadied the air. She noted the security cameras, and the blind corners and the press line forming like a tide. Jax said, "Meet me where the wind tastes like rust," and she pictured the pier without wanting to. Daniel said, "We go together, no heroics," and the word together felt both heavy and right. Maya whispered, "I heard Lila's thinking hum on that line," and the memory of a pen tapping on wood returned like rain. The pier smelled of salt and old nails, and Maya let the rail bite her palm as the bay chopped like broken glass. Priya Shah said, "Tell me what you trust, and I'll test it," and the promise sounded like work and shelter. Daniel said, "We start with chain of custody," and the phrase tried to turn grief into math. Maya said, "I come here to remember what I can't," and the gulls stitched white thread across the gray sky. Jax said, "I saw her here once after the reports," and the words landed like a stone thrown into fog. Priya said, "Memory is evidence with edges," and the wind trimmed the silence clean. The gala glittered like practiced sunlight, and Evelyn Black moved through it, the way a blade moves through cloth. She took Maya's hand and said, "Closure is a gift I help people unwrap," and the sentence smiled too hard. Daniel said, "We're declining donations tied to outcomes," and his tone wore velvet and iron. Maya said, "I prefer answers without ribbons," and the string lights flickered as if agreeing. Evelyn said, "Truth is curated or it drowns," and the orchestra changed key without warning. Priya said, "We should go," and the roses smelled faintly of antiseptic and money. Rain drummed on the window, and the voicemail kept laughing in the wrong place, and Maya let it play twice before stopping it cold. Jax said, "They switched files 2 years ago," and the date unlocked a corridor she had avoided. Daniel said, "Who has that kind of access?" and the question turned and faced their circle. Maya set the sealed letter beside the phone and tried not to measure its weight. Priya said, "If the file moved, a badge moved it," and the room learned a new gravity. Maya said, "I'll open this when the noise stops," and the apartment hummed like a held breath. The diner smelled like burnt sugar and rain tracked the window in thin veins, and Maya watched the door as if it might confess. Jax said, "You don't have to trust me, just the parts you already felt," and his voice shook once. Daniel said, "We verify before we move," and his eyes stayed on the mirror over the pie case. The coffee cooled between them like a stalled engine, and a clock ticked too loud to ignore. Jax said, "The humming on the call was her habit," and the word her hit the table like a coin. Maya said, "Proof first, feelings later," and she mapped exits without looking. Daniel said, "Give us something we can hold," and the jukebox hiccuped mid-song. Jax said, "I know where the switch happened," and the room held its breath with her. Jax slid the sketchbook across the vinyl, and the paper rasped like a whisper with teeth. He said, "I draw what people miss," and the page showed Lila tapping a pen and glancing left as if timing a breath. Maya said, "You were at the pier after the reports," and the sentence steadied her hands. Daniel said, "Dates and places, not vibes," and he drew the napkin closer as if it were evidence. Jax said, "Bus station cameras saw her later than the file says," and the lie inside the record blinked. Maya said, "Then we start there," and the choice tasted metallic and clean. The neon flickered, and the rain outside reset the world. The records room hummed like a tired aquarium, and the metal shelves smelled of dust and bleach. Priya said, "Chain of custody is a story in ink and fingerprints," and the line steadied her own breath. Maya said, "Stories can be edited," and she watched the ceiling camera pretend asleep. Daniel said, "Pull everything that touches the date Jax named," and the request sounded like a dare. Priya said, "Someone anticipated this path," and a drawer squealed open like it regretted the truth. Maya said, "Then we stopped dancing and cut straight," and she felt the old letter in her pocket notice. Daniel said, "Seal every copy," and the box creaked like a throat about to confess. Evelyn called with a smile that pressed through the line like perfume, and the city behind her window made a polite hush. She said, "My foundation funds innocence work. Let me help," and each word balanced like a coin on its edge. Maya said, "Help usually arrives with strings," and the pause that followed tuned itself to warning. Daniel said, "We are declining donations tied to outcomes," and the sentence wore velvet and iron. Evelyn said, "Truth is curated or it drowns," and the phrase set its own table. Maya said, "We prefer currents to cages," and the room felt newly ventilated. The silence after her answer sounded like a glass smile cracking. Night thinned the apartment into shapes, and the sink hissed to give her hands a reason to stay. Maya held the sealed letter above the basin and said, "Not tonight," and the decision steadied her bones. Daniel said, "You choose the moment, not the moment you," and the words set a boundary she could touch. The voicemail's laugh tried to crawl back in and fail. Maya said, "Noise first, then paper," and the hum of the fridge agreed. Daniel said, "We have bus footage to chase," and the map in her head redrew itself clean. She set the letter down like a sleeping thing, and the room finally exhaled. The archive breathed cold and stale as metal, and Maya traced a label before seeing the gap where a folder should live. Priya said, "Someone anticipated our route," and the drawer moaned like a warning. Daniel said, "Cameras cover this aisle," and his voice tried to turn fear into math. Jax said, "Or they only pretend to," and he sketched a tiny eye in the margin of a form. Maya said, "We stopped following and cut across," and the map in her head redrew itself. Priya said, "Missing log entries are louder than screams," and a dust ribbon lifted in the light. Daniel said, "Document the void," and the absence felt heavier than paper. Maya said, "They erased a path and left footprints," and the air sharpened around the truth. The anonymous drive blinked like a heartbeat on the table, and grainy footage opened to a bus station colder than memory. Jax said, "There," and paused on Lila stepping into frame with a backpack and a plan. Maya said, "She outlived the report," and the words steadied and cut at once. Daniel said, "Timestamp holds, if the hash holds," and he copied numbers like lifelines. Jax said, "She looks left before she moves," and the gesture felt like a code they almost knew. Maya said, "She was trying to exit the story," and her throat tightened. Daniel said, "We verify server lineage next," and the laptop hummed like duty. Maya said, "Hope is data when it can be proven," and the room believed her. Behind the church, the alley smelled of wet brick and melted candles, and a witness waited where the stained glass bled color onto the ground. Daniel said, "Coercion leaves fingerprints you can't dust," and he kept his voice low and warm. Maya said, "Who held the pen on your statement?" And the question landed without threat. The witness said, "A woman who never repeated herself," and the phrase scraped memory, raw. Priya said, "Start with dates and pressures," and the pen tapped a rhythm Lila once used. Jax said, "I can map your walk from the bus," and his eyes softened. Maya said, "We will protect what you risk," and the vow fit the night. The church bell muttered like a tired heart. Back at the table, staples on a report gleamed too new, and the paper smelled of a printer that was not the city's. Priya said, "This stack left chain and wore a disguise home," and her voice trembled once. Maya said, "Edges don't lie. Hands do," and she traced a fiber with a light. Daniel said, timestamps argue with each other, and he circled the conflict like a bruise. Jax said, someone choreographed our steps, and he drew little cameras in the margins. Priya said, we are being played, and the room tilted. Maya said, then we changed the music, and the plan sharpened with the word. Daniel said, scan, bag, seal, and ritual steadied them. The SUV idled below Maya's building 2 nights running, and the engine purred like patience. Daniel said, shadowing not spooking, and he watched reflections more than windows. Maya said, then they believe they're still ahead, and she pressed the elevator button twice. Jax said, I can tell the tale, and his grin did not reach his eyes. Priya said, we log plates and patterns, and the words clicked like chess. Maya practiced a face in the elevator mirror that did not tremble, and it almost held. Daniel said, we make them spend energy, and the doors whispered shut. Maya said, we will not flinch for them, and the floors counted upward. The wind combed the rooftop and city noise thinned to a hiss that left room for truth. Jack stared at the ledge and said, I ran errands for a voice that promised safety. He swallowed and added, she never repeated herself, and she paid in silence, not cash. Maya said, describe the voice, and he said, precise, patient, allergic to wasted words. Daniel said, what did you deliver? And Jack said, phones, envelopes, sometimes a route. The sky bruised purple as Jax whispered, she kept everyone clean by keeping me dirty. Maya said, Evelyn, and the name landed like a key sliding into a familiar lock. Jax nodded once and said, I thought she was saving us from louder monsters. Daniel said, we document and sever, but we protect you first, and the lights blinked awake. Dawn rinsed the kitchen with thin gold, and the letter waited like a patient witness. Maya slid a knife under the red seal and said, no more waiting. And the wax parted. Paper breathed and a line of ink said, if I disappear, it was not an accident. Daniel said, there is a date and a place here, and the air tightened around them. Maya said, she wrote this to outrun the edits, and her hand steadied on the fold. The kettle clicked off and forgot to sing, and the room learned a new silence. Daniel said, we treat this as a directive, not a guess, and he copied every mark. Maya said, we go there today, and the decision rose through her like heat. Outside a siren faded, and the letter felt lighter because it finally spoke. The storage unit smelled of cardboard and old sun, and the lock surrendered too easily. Ribbons bound the records, as if dressed for a polite crime that forgot its alibi. Priya said, these should never have left evidence, and the words shook once. Daniel said, photograph everything before we breathe on it, and lifted his phone. Jax said, labels match the dates we flagged, and he traced the ink with a finger. Maya said, this is a path someone hid in plain sight, and the dust danced. Priya said, the route is too clean, and the phrase bent under its own weight. Daniel said, we log custody here and now, and the ritual steadied the room. Maya felt the shape of a trap, and decided to step only where the light fell. Evelyn arrived with 2 polite lawyers and a smile that pretended to forgive. She said, return stolen property and no one gets hurt, and the corridor cooled. Maya said, truth is not your inventory, and the fluorescence hummed harder. Daniel said, we will let a judge weigh custody, and his voice kept its calm. Evelyn said, judges are curated like museums, and the line asked to be feared. Priya stood between them and said, these records moved without authority. Evelyn held Maya's stare and said, closure is a door I own, and did not blink. Jax tilted his head and said, you taught me to be useful, and swallowed it back. Maya said, we are done being catalogued, and the lawyers shifted in unison. The conference room held the kind of quiet that waits for a switch to flip. Jax slid a print beside a sketch and said, they match, and the table agreed. The badge ID'd in the metadata pointed like a compass that refused to wander. Maya said, Priya, your access authorized the swap, and the floor leaned. Priya said, I chose what I called the greater good, and broke a smaller one. Daniel said, greater good ends up a receipt, and the sentence did not blink. Jax said, she used me to keep her hands clean, and his eyes were older. Priya said, I will testify and repair what I can, and she met Maya's gaze. Maya said, begin now, and the plan formed with a speed that welcomed pain. The courtroom filled with the rustle of suits and the weight of eyes, and Priya stepped into the light that does not forgive. She said, I switched the files under pressure, and the gallery forgot to breathe. Daniel said, name the pressure, and his voice held a steady rail. Priya said, access favors the promise that harm would be redirected. Maya felt the floor tilt as memory found a spine. Evelyn whispered to counsel and smiled as if adjusting a mirror. The judge said, proceed, and the word cut a clean path through noise. Jax said, let her finish, and the bench clock ticked like a metronome for courage. Priya said, I am done laundering mercy, and the room believed her for a moment. Maya said, we anchor this with paper, and the story began to stand. The corridor held its cool like a secret, and Daniel met Evelyn where the glass divided city from law. He said, I know the donors you keep on a leash, and his jaw stayed soft. Evelyn said, everyone pays, you just like receipts, and the line glittered. Daniel said, your ledger buys quiet, not truth, and his reflection split the window. Evelyn said, truth is a boutique, and I own the lease, and her eyes did not blink. Maya approached and said, you can rent the room, not the air, and the light thinned. Jax hovered just out of view, counting cameras like stars. Daniel said, the deal ends at the judge's door, and the words felt clean. Evelyn said, doors are curators, and her smile cut gently. Silence finished their sentence. In a side room that smelled of toner, Jax laid a sketch beside a printed still, and the shapes snapped into place. He said, same man, same coat, same watch, and his finger landed on the face. Maya said, he draws a paycheck from the foundation, and heat rose behind her ribs. Daniel said, chain the payments to travel logs, and the pen clicked like a lock. Jax said, he told her the safe house had rules, and the word rules curdled. Maya said, he meant silence, and the syllables dragged. Priya said, we can subpoena his supervisor, and resolve steadied her hands. Jax said, I drew her as she was leaving fear, and the page trembled. Maya said, we give the drawing a witness, and the next step clicked. Back in session, the judge weighed the storage records like a scale that remembered every stone. Counsel argued chain and dust and doors, and the clock learned new patience. Daniel said, custody is unbroken by intent, and his words held. Evelyn kept her spine immaculate, and let silence do its art. Maya said, these files map a confinement disguised as care, and the gallery rustled. The judge said, admitted. And the word fell like rain after ash. Jax exhaled a sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. Priya lowered her eyes and let the verdict of inclusion settle. Maya said, then we proceed on the spine, and the path sharpened. In chambers the air softened but the stakes did not, and the lamp burned a small sun over the table. Priya said, I can point to the fund that paid the driver, and the room leaned in. Daniel said, name account, routing every pass-through, and his pen hovered. Maya said, we do it now, and the syllables landed like boots. Priya said, it roots through a donor-advised veil, and she pushed a folder forward. Jax said, the driver thought refuge meant rest, and his voice thinned. Maya said, refuge became a vault, and the word held. Daniel said, this cracks supply and control, and the lamp hummed. Priya said, I will testify to every step, and the promise steadied itself. The case found its pulse. The blinds sliced the room into gray bars, and the driver stared at the table like it owed him a life. Daniel said, start with who called you, and his tone wrapped the question in calm that would not bend. The driver said, a coordinator from the foundation, and his fingers traced slow circles. Maya said, "You delivered her to a house for rest," and the word rest turned to iron. The driver said, "Rules kept visitors out," and added, "Phones were surrendered, names were trimmed." Priya said, "Did she ask to leave?" and her pen hovered like a bright blade. The driver said, "She asked for a door that stayed open, and watched the blinds like bars." Daniel said, "Who funded the hours you drove?" and ledger names rose like smoke. Maya said, "You know what a vault does to hope," and silence agreed. The driver said, "I thought refuge meant safety," and shame settled like dust. The ledger arrived in a brown envelope that smelled of toner and rain, and the pages hissed when opened. Daniel said, "Follow the loop," and his finger ran the circle of payments like a track. Maya said, "Donations feed a shell that feeds a driver," and a loop bit its tail. Priya said, "Routing passes a donor veil," and she marked each pivot with clean strokes. Jax said, "If I map dates to transit logs, the story draws itself," and his pencil quickened. Daniel said, "We will notarize every step," and the clock found a rhythm. Maya said, "The circle breaks where someone got greedy," and the air felt clearer. Priya said, "Then we pry at the hinge," and the ledger lay still ready to confess. The safe house wore its quiet like a disguise, and dust sailed the window light as if rehearsed. Maya said, "She left because the rules were louder than rest," and her palm found the sill. Jax said, "I hear her hum in this recording," and the old phone crackled with a soft melody. Daniel said, "Titan echoed places her here 2 nights after the sighting," and the number anchored the room. Jax said, "She hummed when thinking," and the tune threaded the air. Maya said, "She left a mind we can follow," and her throat eased. Daniel said, "We log prints and exit patterns," and he photographed every hinge. Jax said, "No struggle, only absence," and the word absence rang true. The dust kept dancing. The deal tasted like a bruise, and the courthouse steps turned into a stage no one loved. Evelyn walked out without titles, but with posture unbroken. She said, "Truth is currency, you only changed the rate," and the press swallowed it whole. Maya said, "You mistook custody for care," and the line held. Daniel said, "Paper cuts deeper over time," and he kept his voice even. Jax said, "She taught me to be useful," and he would not look at her. Evelyn said, "Usefulness is mercy with teeth," and her smile did not move her eyes. Maya said, "We will keep the receipts," and the flash bulbs stuttered like rain. Morning thinned the precinct into clean lines, and the badge looked heavier than metal on the counter. Priya said, "I am closing doors I opened," and she pushed the shield forward. Maya said, "Start with mine," and her voice gentled. Daniel said, "We will need you as a witness," and the words carried both weight and grace. Priya said, "I will testify to every step," and her shoulders stopped trembling. Jax said, "You held the door when I could not," and he drew a tiny open frame on a scrap. Maya said, "We end as we should, not as we began," and the room agreed. The clerk stamped the receipt, and the sound felt like a hinge unceasing. The pier wore a morning hush that kept its promises small, and the bay breathed like a wary animal finding rhythm. Jax said, "You think she would forgive you," and the question carried salt instead of blame. Maya said, "Forgiveness is weather, not a door," and a gust lifted the edge of her coat. Jax said, "I wanted her to be a lighthouse," and the word lighthouse faltered, but did not fall. Maya said, "She was a compass," and we kept ignoring north, and the boards answered with hollow patience. A gull stitched white into gray, and left the seam incomplete. Jax said, "I can still hear her humming," and a thin tune ghosted the rails. Maya said, "We follow the hum until it fades or becomes a song," and the water nodded in slow muscle. Daniel joined with 2 cups and a quiet that knew when not to speak, and the paper lids breathed steam. He said, "You don't have to finish it," and placed one on the rail without ceremony. Maya said, "I used to think finishing meant control," and her fingers found warmth without promise. Daniel said. Finishing is a trick word, and the gulls agreed by not caring. Maya said, then we hold what we can hold, and the cup steadied in her palm. Daniel said, we will keep the spine straight, and the tide tapped its simple answer. Jax listened like a metronome learning mercy. Maya said, together means slower, stronger, and the wind softened by a shade. The sketchbook opened to the last drawing, and graphite turned memory into lines that refused to wobble. Jax said, I drew her as she wanted to be seen, and the page felt newly heavy. Maya said, then that's where I will look for her, and the resolve fit like a clean hinge. Daniel said, we archive the truth she left behind, and his pen signed a date as if blessing it. Jax said, she looked left before courage moved right, and the phrase found a pulse. Maya said, a map can live in a face, and the water braided sound with light. The page waited without shaking. Jax said, I'll keep drawing exits that lead back, and the wind approved with a small push. Across the city, a balcony held its own weather, and Evelyn watched the river braid itself into obedience. She said, control was rehearsal, not the show, and the skyline hummed like a faithful machine. Paper ash rose from a tray, and wrote nothing on the air. She said, curation survives verdicts, and her reflection agreed in the glass. The phone on the table stayed dark because it knew better. She said, truth travels, but invitations still matter, and the wind carried none of it back. Somewhere a siren practiced being final, and then changed its mind. Night pressed its ear to the pier and listened for confessions, and the bay answered with patient dark. Maya said, Lila, I'm still here, and the words chose to be small rather than sharp. Daniel said, we made a spine and it held, and his voice gave the quiet a reason. Jax said, I'll keep the hum safe, and the promise fit his pocket. The wind braided a melody that might have been hers, or might have been the rail. Maya said, survival asks for purpose, and the question opened without consuming. The city blinked like a tired witness, and did not object. Maya said, we decide why, and the water carried the line past the last buoy.